it would be an insult to have a commemoration without the flag.
Because of the new venue, members of the Vietnamese community proudly raise the heritage flag and sing the South Vietnamese national anthem.
This event is for us to remember and commemorate the forefathers who came before us, the sacrifices that they have made, and the struggles that they've been through. And it's a reminder to the youth about what we stand for and what we need to advocate for, which is freedom and democracy.
So April 30th was the day that the Vietnamese people celebrate the end of the Vietnam War, where they successfully reunited the country. Now, there was a Facebook post from weird Confederate groups that were talking about this stuff, and we're going to get into all those things. But what we're going to talk about today is the shared, I guess, solidarity between some South Vietnamese and Vietnamese-Americans who live in the United States now, and people who still think the Confederacy was a worthy cause, and they're really, emotional about that, and they still have the flags and everything. And then we're going to talk about these dead southern countries. I'm going to tie it back to how Vietnamese-Americans support the Republican Party and supported Donald Trump in far higher numbers than any other Asian group in America, and I thought that's an interesting thing to discuss. So yeah, we're going to talk about all that stuff in the video. If you want to support my work continuing for the future, regardless of what YouTube do, please consider becoming a patron. If you want to join our growing community, please check out the Discord and the subreddit in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, check out @the_Kavernacle on Instagram and Twitter. And also u/TommyCahill1995 for my personal Reddit. Also, thanks so much for the support lately. The views have still been great, although the subscribers has been a bit of a grind lately. But we're still chugging away to 35k. Hopefully we will reach that by the end of next month. For every 5k, we get a new chocolate orange. So help me build this pyramid even further. I also live stream 2 times a week on Tuesday and Thursday. The archives of those streams go on my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra, so go check that out for yourself. So I mentioned this in the intro, and here's the Facebook post I was talking about. So there's a Facebook page called the Virginia Flaggers, and I'll get into who these guys are. And they said, today we remember those of another South who also lost their country to Northern invasion and communism. On this day in April 1975, then it has a little thing, one struggle, Southern pride, has a South Vietnamese soldier standing with a Confederate soldier. So there on the right, you have a South Vietnamese flag. Now let's get into who these guys are. So the Virginia Flaggers, and on their Facebook post it says, the Virginia Flaggers was organised on September 5th, 2011. What began with just a few dedicated Southerners has now grown to include hundreds of people from all over the country who've joined us in protesting against heritage offences in Richmond and Virginia and beyond. What is a flagger? When needed, flaggers stand with our flags against those in opposition in a peaceful yet forceful manner to educate and inform the general public, and in open and visible protest against those who attacked us, our flags, our ancestors, or our heritage. Flaggers speak for those who have no voice. We relay a message of honour, dignity, respect and heritage to those who never knew, or to those who have forgotten, and attempt to reach those who refuse to hear. Our weapon is the Confederate battle flag. Our enemies are those who worship ignorance, historical revisionism and political correctness. Now, to stop it there, I made a whole video about General Leobu's, these simps of the Confederacy. And basically my whole series on these groups is about revisionist history. These guys are some of the prime candidates for people who talk about revisionist history. Go check out that video if you want an in-depth debunking of the Confederacy. And they said, we take pride in taking a stand for the cause. For this cause, we call others to flock to the banner of our ancestors, take up their flags and join us in battle. So this wasn't just like a one-off thing. And they posted another thing about this in June 2019. So they said, today we celebrate Vietnam Freedom Fighters Day, an official holiday in Virginia in honour of the over 200,000 soldiers of the Republic of Vietnam who gave their lives fighting to save their country from communism. Today it is illegal to fly the yellow flag with 3 red stripes in communist Vietnam, and it's illegal to honour the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese soldiers who died fighting communism. Many old South Vietnamese veterans are still labelled enemies of the state in Vietnam, and many families have immigrated to escape communist persecution. Today, many thousands of anti-communist Vietnamese families now live in Virginia, where they continue to fight against communism in exile and continue to fly the true flag of Vietnam and honour their veterans and the fallen. The anti-communist yellow flag with the 3 red stripes is officially recognised by Virginia state law, as are holidays about Vietnam's Freedom Fighters Day on June 19th and South Vietnamese Recognition Day on April 30th. So hopefully I can play a clip of what one of these ceremonies look like. They basically just wave the flag and sing the old South Vietnamese national anthem.
Of the new venue, members of the Vietnamese community proudly raise the heritage flag and sing the South Vietnamese national anthem.
I do love how they compare themselves to fighting communism with the Confederacy and South Vietnam. To be fair, there were actually some German communists who fought for the Union, but to say like the Union was like a communist movement is pretty ridiculous. Now, of course, I don't need to say anyone flying a Confederate flag and trying to rehabilitate a Confederate flag is totally delusional about how racist that is as an icon. Now, a fair few of you might not know that much about South Vietnam. You may have experience of, you know, communities who claim to be South Vietnamese in Virginia and in California, where they're most prominent. But basically, it's quite laughable to describe them as any sort of freedom fighters. This was a government essentially created by imperialists when unity elections were disputed and undermined after the French withdrawal from Vietnam. And the guy who became a leader, Diem, who was a Catholic, started like a personality cult. He did numerous awful policies. One was called the Strategic Hamlets Program, where essentially he would take the peasants and put them in around a bit of land they were developing. They made it into a fort. Essentially what it became in most instances was prison for these peasants, because it was meant to undermine the NLF. You guys might know them as the Viet Cong in the South. But Martin Luther King described them as these brutal institutions, and they were. Often they would also make peasants work the land and develop it for the economy and for these hamlets for free. So they literally take you off your land, take you somewhere else, make you work on these things for free. The government was not great, and of course in 1963, with the permission of the CIA, there was a coup against Diem. And then after the coup that removed Diem, the government was essentially like a military dictatorship, did various awful things, was authoritarian. It wasn't some sort of beacon of freedom. They were often like sham elections and everything, but they clamped down on personal liberties to really attack the NLF. So these guys weren't anything special. They had millions and millions, probably billions of dollars pumped into them to modernize these armed forces. Often they were actually just given military surplus from the US, so they're using World War II style weapons rather than the best gear that was saved for the Americans. And these guys actually started out as a very, very poor military force as well. Lost numerous battles to the NVA and the NLF, who were often way, underfunded, under-equipped, had way worse conditions and had less men. Slowly got better under Nixon as he tried to transition the fighting to more of the South Vietnamese forces rather than the Americans, called Vietnamization. But essentially these guys were stooges of the imperialists. They were stooges of the Americans. They were stooges of, the financial interests of other groups like the French there as well. So the South Vietnamese government was not a good government. It wasn't a government for freedom or equality. It took numerous measures against various religious groups, including the Buddhists. You've probably seen that famous photo during the massive Buddhist protest because of them clamping down on these Buddhist groups. And of course, when you have a government which largely includes Catholics, who are outnumbered significantly by Buddhists and other religious groups in Vietnam, then it's obviously a recipe for disaster. And it's a tactic that has been done throughout imperial wars in American history. Just, back the minority, back the person who's willing to get into bed with you and pursue your imperialist aims. But just like the Confederacy, there are probably numerous theories that the South Vietnamese tell themselves about why they lost. Maybe they weren't backed by the Americans, probably think they were sold out by the Americans after the peace deal in 1973 that Nixon agreed to, because of course what the Vietnamese essentially did in the north was build up their strength for a massive invasion, which resulted in the unification of Vietnam. So they probably feel very bitter, and throughout wars which countries often lose, there's often many people, mainly on the right, who push revisionist history or try to rehabilitate the war. So in Germany after World War One, there was a big movement like we could have won if we just stuck with it a bit more. If the Jewish population didn't undermine us, as they used to say, then we would have won. In the US's case with Vietnam in the 1980s, Reagan brought out the noble cause, where This war in Vietnam was actually a noble goal. It was a fight for freedom. The reason the US didn't win is because the government and all these politicians and the student movement really undermined the war effort there, so they couldn't win, which is totally ridiculous when you read about how much arms, money, bombs and everything were used in the Vietnamese conflict. What does backing the US military in Vietnam more even look like? It was a ridiculous amount of force they used, and they still lost. And then obviously you have it with the Confederacy and the South Vietnamese as well. But now let's tie this to how the South Vietnamese experience and coming to America has influenced their political views. Now, the first wave of refugees to America from Vietnam, in massive numbers, was after the fall of Saigon. A lot of the people who fled to America were just poor people who didn't want to suffer reprisals because there's massive fear-mongering about what the North Vietnamese would do, which was significantly overhyped by the Americans, and what came to pass was nowhere near what they predicted and what they told people, but lots of people actually fled because of this. And then you had obviously top people in the military in the South Vietnam and top people in the government, mayors of towns, colonels and stuff who fled to America to avoid reprisals from the communist forces. And then you had a second wave in the 1980s as well. Now, I want to point something out, that Vietnam had about 20 years of US sanctions and embargo after the war. So America not only destroys their country in a way they've never done to anywhere else, maybe Japan is a similar example, but then they actually put sanctions on them, unlike Japan, which they rebuilt. So a devastated economy and country had their situation made worse. So a lot of the South Vietnamese now say that that's the fault of the communist government. I had to flee because the economy was so bad. But in reality, it's a nation that suffered a brutal, brutal war and then has massive sanctions put on it by the most powerful economic player on the planet. There's a good article in the Washington Post from Viet Van Nguyen, and he was talking about why under Trump you've seen more of the Republic of Vietnam flag. And he talks about people who like the Confederacy in the South actually trying to compare them. So it's not just a one-off thing. So he says and writes, I recall the time I gave a speech at a South Carolina university a couple of years ago. I'd never been to the state and only occasionally had visited the South, and usually to the big cities, so I admit being a little worried about how my talk on the war in Vietnam and memory would go over. Yes, I have a stereotype about the South. Unfortunately, the first person to ask a question, an older white man with an enormous bushy beard, confirmed the stereotype. His question, do you know that we fought a war here, and after we lost, we were occupied afterward too? We were victims too, just like your people. So he's comparing the Confederates' war and South Vietnam's war as the same thing. So the article goes on to say he was referring to the two Souths, the American South and South Vietnam, where I was born. True, both had been defeated in civil wars. I suggested to him that while we both might have been victims in some sense, these wars had other victims too, and in the case of black people, their plight far outweighed what happened to the white Southerners. Afterward, he told me he was running for political office. The depth of anti-communist feeling in the Vietnamese community, which includes many military veterans and former government officials, meant they always leaned strongly Republican. While Asian Americans as a whole voted 2-1 for Joe Biden over Trump, Vietnamese-Americans supported Trump over Biden 57% to 41%, a deep animus towards China amplified by misinformation in Vietnamese language media bolstered the support for the president they see as tougher on foreign policy. This dovetailed with their anti-communism. For decades, many in the community harboured the belief that they would one day return to Vietnam to topple the communist regime, first through a military struggle and then later as the veterans age through political struggle. So then he talks about how the South Vietnamese were effectively suppressed by the new communist government, any dissidents imprisoned, the flag outlawed. And then he says, consider in contrast what happened in the United States after its Civil War. Reconstruction lasted little more than a decade. Jim Crow and the KKK rose. The fable and romance of a noble white South took hold and was allowed to flourish in a way, basically, that it didn't in South Vietnam. So he goes on to say the inability of some Americans to acknowledge that the Civil War was fought for slavery and that slavery is an atrocity for which this country is still not properly atoned for symbolically or economically leads to a situation where they can construe themselves as victims, whether at the hands of the Union or by persecution today by the so-called PC elite. Vietnam's history of colonization and occupation by outside powers produces a murkier problem of who among the Vietnamese was on the right side of history. But he talks about the South Vietnamese community and how they view, their expulsion or fleeing Vietnam. They said this trauma helps to account for the emotional susceptibility that brings many Vietnamese refugees in line with a powerful sentiment held by Americans. When Trump calls his supporters the forgotten men and women of our country who will be forgotten no longer and tells them that everyone is listening to you now, he may be speaking to white people, but his words resonate with Vietnamese refugees who feel forgotten and dwell in or perhaps enjoy their resentment against those who defeated them. So they wave their yellow flag, the symbol of their lost cause, and it is accepted by believers in other lost causes. So that was a very good article, and I don't totally agree with everything that was in it that I didn't read to you, because he's talking about the Vietnam War and like who's on the right side and stuff. But it's safe to say, after all that's happened and where Vietnam now is as a society, the current government of Vietnam is far better than the South Vietnamese government. There's really no question there. Of course, you could argue about political freedoms, freedom of speech, but just because this was called the Republic of South Vietnam and it had a sham democracy before being, basically a military dictatorship, didn't mean people had freedom of speech or personal freedoms. So you mix the worst parts of a capitalist society, where it actually does have an authoritarian capitalist government siding with the imperialists and everything, and then you also don't have the freedom that you often associate with so-called Western democracies. Whereas now in Vietnam, it's not like China. It's not like North Korea. People often say Vietnam is totalitarian. That's pretty laughable. Of course, there are certain things you can't say. It's a one-party state as well. And of course, maybe the freedom of speech is not the same as you'd get in America, but they also have, often better social programs. And as an emerging economy, it's actually one of the better ones in the region. So, by most metrics, it's doing better. The same way I'd say, the Cuban government has done better than the Baptista regime. And a lot of people often try and dispute that with me, even like so-called leftists. But I think when you actually look at it objectively, there is no doubt in my mind that the current communist governments have run their countries better than the old capitalist authoritarian governments. Just one more thing about like the links between them and how this Trump language appeals to them, but also the Confederate language. So Vietnamese-American Republicans posted in July about, the push to remove controversial statues of old school American figures like General Lee. So it says extremist leftists are trying to erase American history by tearing down statues and teaching a slanted version of our history in our schools and colleges. Yet it's not just Confederate generals having their statues torn down. These radical anarchists don't want any history to survive the racist origins of the Democrat Party. Look at Andrew Jackson, a former decorated general and the father of the Democratic Party. Jackson firmly believed in slavery, yet our Antifa and BLM members refusing to accept $20 bills with Jackson's picture on them. I don't know where they've got that from, because most people who are against General Lee aren't pro Andrew Jackson. But you can see, where they often buy the same stuff as them. And it's interesting the link between them. Now, I want to go into their love for Trump, and I want to give one person's account of why he likes Trump. So Al Jazeera did a good article. So Matthew Truong, 53, we don't want the US to be a communist country, and maybe it plays into the other article that said these communities are often targeted with misinformation actually put in Vietnamese. So he says, we look at Biden and particularly Harris. Actually, she is a lot more left than Bernie Sanders, which is pretty laughable. And so if Bernie Sanders is a progressive socialist, a democratic, whatever the term is you want to use, she's to the left of that. Therefore, she's leaning towards communism. The fact that this person thinks Kamala Harris is a communist is very funny. We escaped from communism. We lost Vietnam to communists. We arrived here and rebuilt our lives again. We knew communism, us Vietnamese, and so therefore we do not want the United States to become a communist country. They know that they don't want communism. They lived under it. They feel passionate about it and angry. And the way to get the anger out is to vote. And we have done that in droves already. And like I said, that is what happened with the elections, where the Vietnamese community supported Trump by quite a wide margin. Now I want to talk about the various little enclaves that have been set up in America of these Vietnamese people who are really still upset about the death of South Vietnam. But just to go over quick why they might like Trump, weirdly I was reading they love Trump because he's anti-China. But it's quite funny because obviously Vietnam historically didn't like China. Why the domino theory was so flawed is because Ho Chi Minh himself, described himself as a nationalist. Vietnamese nationalists do not like China. So they weren't just going to become a stooge of China. It wasn't going to become a colony of China. And as, history shows us, the Vietnamese actually went to war with China in 1979 and won. So that tells you everything about how these communists actually viewed China. But it's just funny because they're coming from like a Vietnamese nationalist position, but, you know, they don't even really recognize the current state of Vietnam. It was just, you know, pretty interesting to me. They also like Trump for being anti-communist because, of course, they're anti-communist as well. That's a big thing with these, you know, refugee communities, Cuban communities as well. And that's why they always lean heavily Republican. But OC Register did a good article. So they say, history and culture at play. When Frank Zhao arrived in Orange County at the age of 27 in 1975, he landed in GOP land. Orange County was the birthplace of Nixon and the ideological birthplace of the John Birch Society. The country was, as President Reagan would later joke, good Republicans go before they die. Zhao says, Orange County was heavily Republican, and as a new guy, you just go with the party. Many followed after. The community created a thriving business district along Bolsa Avenue in Westminster, the largest Little Saigon outside of Vietnam. Today, Orange County is home for about 200,000 people who were born in Vietnam or who are of Vietnamese descent, with large pockets in Westminster, Garden Grove, Santa Ana, and Fountain Valley. Zhao went from refugee to businessman, helping to mold the thriving Little Saigon district. His company, Bridge Creek Group, developed and owns more than 1,000 properties. So it's funny that totally moral South Vietnamese refugees come to the US to become landlords, essentially. So the Republican Party, he said, represents ideals that gel with the Vietnamese community. Family, patriotism, entrepreneurship, and self-reliance. For GOP, he believes, also opposes communism and government interference. Westminster Mayor Tri Ta, who arrived in the US at 19 in 1992, cited similar policies that drew him to register as a Republican. I believe in Republican principles like being conservative, really promoting family values, free enterprise, less government control, and freedom for everyone, for every individual. Since the wave of Vietnamese immigrants came as refugees fleeing communism, that first generation saw themselves as distinct from other immigrant groups. But also, I was talking earlier about the Vietnamese flag and the South Vietnamese flag, and why we've seen it, you know, recently in different current events. So The Conversation did a good article just describing it. So as I wrote in my 2018 book, The Returns of War, South Vietnam and the Price of Refugee Memory, some Vietnamese-Americans view their fallen homeland as an extension of the American push for freedom and democracy worldwide. I've interviewed Vietnamese-American soldiers who fear American freedom is failing and fervently believe in the US activity in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. For them, flying the South Vietnam flag is a show of nationalism, a militarized patriotism, and that is simultaneously South Vietnamese and American. So that is also like an interesting link. And I don't know if you get this in other refugee communities. Like, has anyone ever heard of Afghan refugees or Iraqi refugees? The only parallel in my mind is people from Cuba, obviously in places like Miami, and obviously like a lot of the Vietnamese, these people who fled Castro, while often depicted as like the poorest farmers and peasants in the land, a lot of them were actually massive plantation owners, landowners, top officials of the Baptista regime, people in local governments as well throughout Cuba who were in bed with Baptista and the Americans. So it's not surprising they're so anti-communist and associate America with freedom and support this militarism as well, because maybe they feel like, you know, America helped us, they gave us our home after the war, they tried to save us from evil communism, and we should repay that by being more nationalistic towards American foreign policy. But it's not all doom and gloom, despite the, you know, the bad numbers of how many voted for Trump. What I've been reading a lot is that younger Vietnamese Americans are sort of rejecting this, because while they might be sometimes sympathetic to South Vietnam and the lost country and stuff, they will not tolerate someone like Trump, who they feel drums up xenophobia against communities just like them. So the Al Jazeera article from earlier says, the grassroots Progressive Vietnamese American organization was founded against the backdrop of the 2016 presidential election. Its members and hundreds of volunteers are actively campaigning for Joe Biden. It has invested heavily in Vietnamese language, digital TV and print ads, and created Viet Fact Checked, which has been dispelling misinformation throughout the election. So that is totally great that there are Vietnamese Americans who come from these refugee communities who are helping to fight back against their parents', you know, often gross views on politics. But to summarize and stuff, I thought it was just an interesting video. You guys know how I like to make videos on dead countries and simps for dead countries, whether that be the Confederate States of America, Rhodesia, apartheid South Africa, Imperial Japan, and now we also have South Vietnam. And it's just funny that the people who are simps for the Confederacy are also simps for the South Vietnamese. and how their struggle is the same, but it's really, really not the same. And there's not really too many parallels there, apart from they're both Southern. Because in the Confederate case, you have these people who secede from the Union primarily just because of slavery, right? And then even afterwards, they're not significantly punished, and they're able to maintain a similar system to slavery for, over 100 years. You could argue still exists in some form today with prison labor. Whereas in South Vietnam, this government was a stooge of the imperialists, mainly the Americans, but various other European business interests. The French still had quite a big say in South Vietnam. And one of the things missing is that the Vietnam War wasn't just like a war between two warring states like North Vietnam and South Vietnam. It was a popular uprising in the South, which had been going on for, over a decade by 1975. It was these two forces. And the Vietnamese often used to get mad at the Koreans for trying to compare their struggles during the Vietnam War, because the Koreans would be like, we're just like you, North and South divided by the imperialists, and we want a unified Korea. And they're like, you're not like us, because there isn't a mass movement for unification in the South under your leadership, where there is a mass movement in the South right now fighting the current South Vietnamese government so we can take over a unified Vietnam. Obviously, Ho Chi Minh is like the founding father of Vietnam, who was extremely popular throughout the whole country. That's part of the reason why they didn't actually let these elections go ahead in the first place just after World War II, because he would win and he was a communist, despite actually helping the Americans fight the Japanese in the war. But if you're a Confederate simp, you're probably also a massive anti-communist Trump supporter, so your solidarity exists, I guess, with the refugee community, who often have very similar views to you. And also you saw on that Facebook page with Vietnamese Republican Americans that they're taking on the same cultural war issues as these Confederate Sims. So it's an interesting, path these two groups have been on, where they have had very different histories. They are fighting extremely different conflicts in extremely different times. But through, I guess, their existence in America, they found a bit of a common cause in their culture war politics and anti-communism. Just an interesting thing. I don't know how many of you guys would have been interested in this, but as someone who loves Vietnamese history, I want to go traveling Vietnam, and I just, love history in general, found this very, very interesting. I could go on all day about the Vietnam War, but I'll cut the video here. So if you want to follow me on social media, check me out at the Kavernacle on Twitter and on Instagram. Please come join our communities on Discord and my subreddit, and that is in the description as well. And if you want to support my work, a lot of my videos don't get monetized, please support my Patreon. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.